All right, welcome everyone to our sixth and final seminar in our series on building capacity for sustainable development. I am Alicia Harley, Senior Research Fellow in Sustainability Science here at the Kennedy School of Government. We're delighted you're here with us today, and for those of you who attended previous seminars, welcome back. A special shout out to Fiaz Ahmed of Sunway, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, University Malaysia, who came to all 6 seminars and is finishing up his dissertation, which explores the role of CEO social networks in driving firm behavior around sustainable development goals. The seminar series seeks to integrate insights from scholars and practitioners on how to build and strengthen capacities for sustainable development. Today, we're focusing on building the capacity to govern cooperatively in pursuit of sustainability, or said another way, how to work together to actually get stuff done. Solving sustainability challenges requires coordination and cooperation amongst a wide variety of actors with diverse resources, abilities. That is, it requires governance. At the same time, in the rapidly changing Anthropocene system, governance arrangements must become better equipped to respond not to just individual challenges such as increasing heat intensity or infectious diseases, but to multiple interacting stressors all happening at once. Meeting the goals of sustainable development will therefore require the capacity of diverse actors, often with competing interests and unequal power, to work together in the face of deep uncertainty. In today's seminar, we will explore this theme by talking to 3 leading practitioners who have all spent their careers facilitating the kind of collaboration and coordination necessary to achieve sustainable development goals. I'm really delighted to have 3 incredible women with us today to discuss this important topic and for our final seminar. We have Vanessa Adams, CEO of Level 4 International and formerly at AGRA, the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa. We have Kate Gordon, CEO of California Forward and formerly with the DOE, amongst many other things. Everyone will introduce themselves in specifically around the question of capacity building and governance on their own better than I can. So I'm just doing a brief here. And then finally, we have Robin McGuckin, who's the Executive Director of P4G, which focuses on financing early stage partnerships at the World Resource Center. So we're really delighted to have all of you. And that's it for my intro. Let's get into the discussion. Thank you again. So we're just going to start off with a round robin, starting this time in alphabetical order, which means Vanessa, then Kate, and then Robin, talking a little bit about your background and how it intersects with this question of building the capacity more broadly to work together to get stuff done. How do you see your view of facilitating partnerships and how does that align with your biography? Thank you. All right, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for inviting us and hosting us. And wow, it's really great to see everyone who's joined online. I have been working for over 20-something years in Africa. I'm calling in from Kenya. I've been working with different institutions in Africa, including creating some public-private partnerships, some platforms which are industry focused, other engagements which have been about bringing governments together to share best practices while I was vice president of strategic partnerships at AGRA. And today we have a small consultancy firm called Level 4 International. And even today, collaboration and cooperation and partnership are critical to deliver on some extremely challenging regulatory frameworks like the EUDR, which I'll talk about later, which is the EU's attempt to regulate deforestation and agricultural commodities being imported into Europe. And this is a case where multiple governments across multiple continents have to agree and collaborate with the private sector. It couldn't get more complicated.
All right. Thank you, Vanessa. Kate?
Hi, thanks so much. Great to be here. Great to see folks online. So I started my career really not in the energy and climate space at all, but as a tenant organizer and a community organizer. And I think that's important just because it has grounded a lot of the work that I've done over the last 20 years in kind of starting where people are, thinking about bringing different stakeholders to the table, thinking about really digging in on folks' kind of core fundamental needs in order to have a conversation that really resonates across different sets of people. And I've done that, not just at the community level, but also with, private companies, with labor, with environmental groups. One of the early organizations that I helped to found and then run was called the Apollo Alliance, which was sort of the first green jobs organization bringing labor, community, environment, and business all together around kind of specific policy interventions. And so I think the organizing piece, and also I'm trained as a lawyer, which I actually think is quite helpful, lawyer and city planner, in that, it really has been useful in my work to have a good sense of the other kind of the potential arguments against a thing, or the potential weaknesses in the argument, or the potential holes, which is very much what you're taught as a lawyer, and then to kind of bring those to the fore when both engaging with people and communities, but also writing policy. In general, my take on kind of the climate and energy work I've done is very much place-based. So really thinking about how different policies and climate impacts apply in different places. And then also very much around economic development and around sort of the economic impacts of those policies that is very resonant with people on the ground, I think. The only other thing I'll say is, in my last 5 years before my current role, and we'll talk later about this, but I've spent a lot of time in government. So 3 years in state government in California, 2 years in federal government, working for the Department of Energy. And in those roles, what I really tried to do was to help create structures that allowed for people to then do the kind of work I was doing before. So allowed for structures to build capacity on the ground, to do organizing, to do community building, to do place-based work. I do think government has an interesting role to play there. So I'll leave it at that. Lisa, back to you.
Well, I hope you'll talk a little bit more about that later, because we would love to hear more. But I'll go to Robin now.
Yeah, thanks so much for hosting this discussion and producing this interesting line of papers on a very timely subject. My background, I grew up overseas, and I think that informed me early on the challenges of speaking to people who are very different from you and people who are very different from each other, communicating. And I took that into a career working on really as an engineer, trying to deliver impact on the ground in the international context, primarily in emerging market and developing economies. And what I found in my different work, both I worked in government for a number of years for USAID, a little bit of time with Department of Energy as well. And then also worked in the private sector for a large global engineering firm, really developing infrastructure around the world, and got to see a lot of different models for how infrastructure is developed, both very large infrastructure as well as very small micro infrastructure for individual household users, for example, and experience a bunch of the different processes that different countries and different sectors use to enable that kind of dialogue that can be extremely tense, because with large infrastructure, for example, you can be disrupting a lot of people's lives and livelihoods, as well as hopefully, of course, creating livelihoods and jobs while preserving environment. But all of that is a tough balancing act to strike. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed is learning the different mechanisms for bringing people together and trying to acknowledge and give space for that tension, while also figuring out constructive ways to work through that tension to a solution that is as close to win-win-win as possible.
Wow. Well, I hope you can tell us all of those mechanisms and create a user guide to get this done for a bunch of us today, or at least the start of it. Great, thank you so much. We're gonna now jump into sort of the meat of our discussion. We'll also again do round robin in the same direction, and then later I'm gonna flip the round robin around. But starting with Vanessa, I've asked all of the speakers to think a little bit about one example that they can dig into of a successful time they were able to really build the capacity to work together. And hopefully this will allow us to get into some of these mechanism stories and structures. So Vanessa, moving to you.
I hate having to pick one story and one example. It's torture. So
Yes.
I'm gonna veer off into two. And the reason there's a rationale for this. One is a country-specific example and one is a regional example. And I think that they have very different implications to the theory of what you're driving towards. And I wanted to just make one plug while I'm doing this for the Food Systems Summit process. So if you weren't tracking this, this was a global multi-stakeholder engagement process. And now 4 years later, they're actually trying to measure progress on commitments from 4 years ago at a global scale towards food systems transformation. So that's the end of the story. I'm going to go back to the beginning now and explain why that's important, because measuring multi-stakeholder regional platform progress and impact, I think it's a bit of a forest and a trees scenario. So about 16, 17 years ago, I was working as the lead at the West Africa Trade Hub, which was a USAID funded project across 20 countries of West Africa with shea butter and shea producers and shea pickers and shea traders. And amongst, 8 different supply chains I was working in, this one was the most compelling in terms of rural community impact. Is it probably this shea story, that shea is picked by about 20 million women in Africa. And so it couldn't be more critical in terms of local representation. The thing is, though, that everyone, and still today, but less so, people feel that women aren't actually getting enough value out of that supply chain. So there's this animosity that governments would have towards the buyers and traders because it's as if they were stealing from the women. But if you lived in a village in Mali like I did, or spent time in rural Burkina Faso or other countries, you would actually see that this shea nut was contributing supplemental income and off seasonality towards women's livelihoods. So they didn't worry about being stolen from. They just wanted to have any market and more market and have better quality. There was a lot of tension in that supply chain. And over time, we decided to put everyone at the table. It took quite some machinations and trickery to get people to agree, who were essentially in a non-transparent supply chain, competing with each other, not sharing information whatsoever, to sit around and agree that there was much more critical value working together in a global shea alliance than there would be for any individual company or any country to work separately from each other. And over the last 15 years, the Global Shea Alliance has actually gone from those initial 26 signatories to an agreement to more than 400 members. And I'm probably wrong with my numbers. Maybe there's even 600 members today. Private sector with public sector funding, but a lot of government realization and facilitation for investment in processing to come into West Africa. And so the bulk of the processing for shea actually goes as a cocoa butter substitute and follows the cocoa market. Sorry, I'm going deep in ag supply chains for this example, but why I think it's relevant and interesting is that tension between processors who make a really low margin and need high-tech equipment to be able to do processing closer to source, which then eventually brings more value to those women and to the collective communities. But the end of the story today is that after all of this investment and processing coming into the landscape, people started to realize that the shade trees were at risk. So there's actually been such an increase in demand for the shea nuts and shea butter that the shade trees aren't actually producing enough, and the ones which are being cut, as everybody knows, to deforestation, and there's a lot more threat into the environment, and still lack of ownership on the ground. As you know, a lot of common land management processes and a lack of incentive to be planting trees, and a lot of myths around these trees as well. So there's a real challenge from an environmental perspective, from an ecosystem management perspective, and the transparency that I was talking about earlier on the EUDR, which is mostly focused on cocoa and coffee, but should actually come into other supply chains like cashews and shea nuts as well. And this is where the real value can get reversed and come back to the landscape. And so there's now an action for shea parklands, which is an advocacy mechanism where private sector is actually enabling planting of shade trees, which nobody thought were plantable. When I started working, people said it's a wild crop, nobody plants shade trees. Now they're actually being planted, grafted. There's research going on at a whole nother level in this sector. So it's super complicated, a lot of inherent competitiveness and tension. Countries who are thinking that they're competing with each other, but they're actually facilitating trade with each other. And then a lot of issues on regulation to be able to support at the base and in these villages, the women pickers who don't own the land, but they have customary access to picking their shea nuts from their trees. And so who's responsible to not cut, to cut, who's responsible to protect trees. And so this is the kind of supply chain relevant and specific work where governance in industry alliances historically is weak. Industry alliances are often weak. Governments tend to see competing with each other as beneficial rather than collaborating together to join forces and invest in research and sharing knowledge, and having then aligned regional standards and regulations which reinforce that regional trade, which is happening anyway. So lots of interesting backstories with that. And I could flip this, but that's West Africa specific, whereas the coffee stories are much more East Africa, and you know, so you have similar but different issues in other tree crops, but a lot higher value. And everybody knows coffee is kind of like the golden crop with cocoa, and shea is kind of the lost poor woman's crop. So I think there's interesting undercurrents of bias that come also within not just countries, but rural communities and specific supply chains as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Did you have, you wanted to do a second example, or this was the example?
I don't
Sorry.
know. I am really
Okay,
bad on
okay,
time. I don't want to
okay.
usurp
Yeah, no,
anybody's time. I could go on
perfect.
and on,
I mean,
but
that was such a rich example. I think I just wanted to make sure I wasn't stepping on your toes. I'm gonna move on to Kate, but I want to come back afterwards and talk a little bit about the early stages of the partnership and the ways in which built trust, but then how that's morphed, especially with new challenges, especially to the environmental resources, or the natural resources that go into the supply chain, and threats to them. Kate.
So Lisa, and you just froze for me for just a second, and I feel like everyone else was still moving. So I think it might have been you. So I'm just flagging for you that you just froze briefly.
Thank you.
Now you're back. Yeah, that was such an amazing story, Vanessa. Thank you for that. And although I think there are so many differences in these individual stories, there's a lot of parallels actually to sort of how, challenges and bringing folks together. I also had a hard time thinking of one example, but I will do probably the most recent one from the Department of Energy. So when I came into as a senior advisor to Secretary Granholm, she really had me come in at the beginning of the administration. Her goal was to think about how the Department of Energy could start doing place-based approaches to its work. DOE had been traditionally, as you probably know, since the 70s when it was formed, very much a research and science organization. The labs, 17 national labs, a lot of engineers, a lot of scientists, a lot of work on like engineering feed studies and early R&D. All of that. And so I did a fair amount of work at the beginning, like looking across the agency for examples of place-based work, which is a whole story in and of itself and quite interesting because the place DOE was mostly doing that was in the environmental management program, which is the program that cleans up the nuclear processing sites from back in the sort of early days, the atomic bomb days. So that's a whole other story. But they have long-term 90-year relationships with these places because of how long it takes to decommission. But what I wanted to talk about is that while I was there, really big sea change at the department, which was the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or also formerly known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That bill did a significant amount. I think in the US, everybody always talks about the Inflation Reduction Act as the big climate bill. Actually, the infrastructure bill is just as important. It created a significant amount of funding for basic infrastructure for a clean energy economy, for an energy transition. So infrastructure around EV charging, battery manufacturing, early stage projects on hydrogen, direct air capture, a significant amount on transmission and transmission resilience. So just massive $62 billion to the Department of Energy for big steel in the ground infrastructure projects. This was a very different world for the department, going from these engineering feed studies, very high level at the labs at academic institutions, for the most part, some amount of work on weatherization and rebates in communities, to this like giant infrastructure and anchor energy project development agency. So, this is sort of a story of structure, government structure being important to governance, but also personnel being important to governance. We ended up reorganizing the whole department, which I won't talk about right now, but we created new parts of the agency and reorganized. But the other thing that we did, and this comes back to my role in the secretary's office, the secretary was really concerned, and we were really concerned about how do we make sure that these projects work on the ground? Kind of to what Robin was saying, there's so many tensions when you're doing work to move a climate and energy transition agenda. A lot of that work is fundamentally industrial. You're building big systems in places, right? So there are tensions fundamentally between what you think of as the benefits of those projects in the places, right? There's tensions around how do you balance job, family supporting job creation, pathways into those jobs for folks who have not been in the energy sector in the past. It's a very male and white sector, with potential environmental harm from the project, with the impact on the local economy, with the need for all these supportive services in these places, many of which are quite rural and don't have a lot of existing infrastructure. So all of a sudden we went to this world in which we had to really think about the place-based impacts of these projects. And so it's an interesting story internally. I'll just say first, internally, negotiating those tensions was first of all an internal issue. What I did, and I was really fortunate to be in the position I was in. I was in the secretary's office. I had the soft power of that position. I had no budget. I had no staff, but I did have the ability to say I was in the secretary's office. That really mattered because it meant I could pull people together from across the agency. I wasn't in an individual department. I wasn't siloed. I think that's really important. Having a kind of a higher level connection point is really important. I was able to pull together the head of our Office of Energy Justice, the head of our Office of Energy Jobs, the head of our Office of Indian Energy, and start a conversation about if we were to, like, what are the goals in these projects? How do we ensure these projects create real benefits on the ground? And how do we do it? First of all, what do we mean by benefits? So we had a whole internal negotiation around that. And then what kind of tactical approaches can we take to ensure that the benefits are thought through when the projects are happening? long story, but what we ended up doing after a very long negotiation I'm having to talk more about is we ended up using the procurement process of the department to require that those applying for the federal dollars, both loan and grant dollars, articulate a community benefits plan or community benefits strategy with 4 parts, with meaningful engagement with community and workers, with a specific approach to family supporting jobs and pathways into those jobs, with a specific approach to diversifying both workforce and contractor bases, and a specific approach to ensuring benefits for community, for what the administration called Justice 40 communities, but really communities that had been sort of frontline communities. So incorporating this idea that these projects, not siloing this, but saying, look, there's a 4-part plan. You need to articulate with all those pieces, all of which are overlapping, right? Like all of which have pieces of each other. And then we made it 20% of the application. So we scored it at 20% of the application. I think really, really interesting. What ended up happening with this? Well, first I'll say it required us to redo a lot of things. Like the DOE application review process is all non-political in general. Political entities are not allowed to do this, but it was almost all scientists and engineers, right? It was all people with expertise in the technology, because Congress had given us technology-specific money. We had to build out a review system that also brought in social scientists and people with experience doing community engagement. Super interesting. Also people with labor and workforce background. Built out a new review system, did an enormous amount of training of career contract staff in how to think about this as part of the contract and procurement process, did an enormous amount of training to folks outside, to companies in particular, that had not thought about this. I mean, the uncomfortable reality is that the companies that had thought a lot about this were the big oil and gas and resource companies, the mining companies, the oil and gas companies, because they've had to do this for a long time. They've been in a lot of contentious community engagement, and they've built out structures of community engagement, and for good or bad, they've done a lot. The startup companies in the like solar and wind and biotech and hydrogen, no idea what we were talking about. Like, had never thought about this. VC funded startup companies, right? Had never thought about communities. So it's super interesting to kind of see that culture play out. So lots of education. Ended up creating like really a system of thinking about this that I think had happened in multiple ways in other countries. Canada's been doing similar approaches for a long time. We learned a lot from Canada. But a lot of companies hire community engagement specialists, created a whole consulting class. Lots of things came out of this. And many of the projects had really, really interesting benefits approaches. We held up as a gold standard the company creating an enforceable negotiated contract with communities or workers, a project labor agreement, a community benefits agreement, a good neighbor agreement, et cetera. Many of them ended up doing that. So, I guess I'll just say, Alicia, and then I'll stop. Was it a success? On the one hand, the community benefits plans were in the day 2 order from the new secretary of pieces of the department's work that had to be thrown out. So in the initial order on day 2 on throwing out all the diversity, equity, inclusion work, community benefits plans were specifically mentioned. So everyone went into a little bit of chaos because it was like, oh, we're already doing contracts with these people. We're sending out money. The plan is part of the contract procurement process. You can't really sever it, right? So lots of legal conversation. I will say, again, tactics matter. We designed this so it was in the contract and hard to sever. We designed it so the 4 parts were intersecting, so you could sever one of them, i.e. Justice 40, and the other ones all make up for many of the same benefits. We designed them so the gold standard was individually negotiated contracts that were outside of the department. Those are separate contracts, and they can't be touched by the federal government. So it's an interesting question. So was it a success? I think it would have been more successful had this administration not gone after it. But I also think what we ended up doing, I think, was creating a lot of capacity on the ground to think about projects in a new way. And I'm seeing a lot of people, especially in California where I am now, and I'm now working on the implementation of these in a lot of cases, Lithium Valley, a lot of transmission resilience, a lot of the wildfire work. We're seeing people actually take pieces of that and apply them through local and state policy, apply them through individual contract negotiations. We're seeing governance structures kind of around like empowerment zones come together. It's super interesting. So I think it did change the conversation. And I think it is an interesting just reminder of why people matter. The secretary gave us the ability to do this. It was her, her having our backs that let us do it, and being behind this process. So did the White House. The White House was very supportive. So it really does matter. Yeah, so that's a good example. That's my big example of the moment. I have others, but it's been interesting going from doing that to now doing a lot of the work on the ground to help make sure it continues.
Yeah, I'm gonna loop back around to you, Kate. That was fantastic and so interesting. I'm curious when we come back around to learn a little bit more about, well, how this is applying forward in your work at California Forward, but in the context of this debate that I know you're aware of because I see what you post on LinkedIn, but this tension between moving fast and providing these processes for equity.
The
So
abundance debate.
the
Yes,
abundance
happy to
debate,
talk
yeah. So but I'm gonna get to you after we talk to Robin. So thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Really interesting, interesting stories from both of you. Thanks so much for that. I'm going to talk, I've got a couple examples too, but I'm going to talk first about what we do at P4G, because it is a partnering approach, and I think it's interesting to share as sort of a case study in partnering. So P4G is an initiative that is housed at the World Resources Institute. WRI is, a think tank research institute that works on people, nature, and climate. The way P4G is set up is we actually accelerate climate tech startups, and specifically climate tech startups in emerging market and developing economies. And with those climate startups, we take a very unique approach to mentoring them through what we call national platforms. And our national platforms are a public-private collaboration that has two co-chairs. There's a government co-chair that is comprised of a core ministry, typically the Ministry of Planning, Investment, Finance, or equivalent, that is the central ministry in charge of climate finance and climate planning. And then the other co-chair is the leading industry association for that country. And through our government national platform members, we're able to have connections to all the line ministries, including energy, agriculture, food, if that's separate, et cetera, which then gives us connections to the regulators and often the standard setters, and the folks responsible for enforcement of regulations. And what we're able to do then is with our climate tech startups, we are looking specifically in our application process for them to tell us about their regulatory and policy barriers that they face, those marketplace challenges or hurdles that they already know that they're going to run into. And we're looking for in our startups, businesses that are already incorporated in that country and have maybe had their initial proof of concept, their initial product or service on the marketplace. And they're trying to get their next customer set and then grow from a seed stage investment to a Series A stage investment to really spur them on that exponential growth journey that we're hoping some of them will be able to take. Many of our startups think that they're going to encounter one barrier, and they do, but then they find two or three more along the way, along the journey with us. And that's where our national platforms are so important. What we do with our national platforms is we introduce them to our partnerships. Our startups are called partnerships. This is another key element of the equation here, which is that our startups are themselves comprised of a startup company and an NGO. And that NGO fulfills one of three functions, um, uh, being a think tank or a thought leader on policy, uh, uh, um, being an environmental or social organization that can help to quantify and verify the environmental, social, and governance impact metrics. Um, and then finally, community outreach. So community outreach can be and is, of course, a very important part of any startup's journey because the community is also their customers, and also the people impacted by their product or service. And so we are, in a sense, forming this, constellation of stakeholders that are there for the startup as it encounters those barriers to go and say, I'm running into this issue. We need to do a study on what it would mean if we change the regulation from allowing this to allowing that, and how would it be enforced? And then through our funding, they're able to bring together the right stakeholders to actually do that analysis. And oftentimes, it's, for example, in the energy sector, it's a very technical analysis. Um, and then to hold workshops and dialogues that are convened through our national platforms. And here's the interesting things is that we don't necessarily need to have our exact ministry and industry association focal points at every workshop, but we want to have them aware and telling us who within their network should be part of that workshop or dialogue. And then through that network, getting the right people at the table, and not too many, and hopefully not too few, because you've got to be inclusive enough, and then workshopping through the issue to overcome it. And so we've had a lot of success doing this. We have a recent case study on electric vehicles in Kenya, where we worked with 10 startups since 2018, and have had very tangible impacts, such as reducing the tariff on knockdown kits, electric vehicle knockdown kits, by 15%. Developing a master plan for the city of Nairobi for charging infrastructure, and a number of other other great accomplishments that happened because these startups were talking to the national platforms and then together working as a collaboration to assess and overcome that challenge. And a final important factor here is that all of our startups are operating in a key growth sector for that economy. So electric vehicles in Kenya, as an example, renewable energy and electrification of vehicles is one of the top 5 green growth priorities of Kenya. So the ministry and the private sector can really be aligned around that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Robin. I'd love to come back to you when we go around one more time to think a little bit about both metrics for measuring changes on the ground, going a little bit to what Vanessa was talking about, and also just thinking about talking through some of the mechanisms when you're facilitating these partnerships. How do you actually get people to talk to each other? What is the sort of daily experience of doing that? All right, going back, starting. Let's go back to Vanessa, and we'll just do the same direction because I've given you all warnings now. Vanessa.
I can't remember for the life of me what my warning was, but I'll go right for it and assume that you'll stop me at some point.
Well, but I can tell you a little. Oh, your time warning I haven't given you, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about trust building early on in creating the Share Better partnership and how that's evolved over time, especially to date with increasing environmental challenges and bigger groups of people.
So, okay, I think trust is an interesting question and super context intensive, right? But one of the things that I thought about as I read the paper draft and the principles of this collaboration for sustainability concept was actually more to the point you were talking about. How quickly can we get there? Are we hampering progress by collaborating and consulting and having these really heavy processes at local levels and regional levels, and in some ways over-promising to local communities who expect change to occur for themselves and then don't see the change happening? And so to what degree are we creating a level of disappointment or disenfranchisement through over consultation? So this is something which I think is not necessarily beneficial if the community of practice and the government stakeholders aren't prepared to come back to those they've been consulting with and give back or provide some of the solutions that they discussed, or at least feedback to say, we can't afford this. What you've outlined is absolutely unmanageable for us. We're already in deficits, which we know they are. So I think there's some inherent challenges and trade-offs between the collaboration requirements and the consultative process and moving towards a more sustainable environment and ecosystem. So I think I just wanted to come back to the premise of, I'm a partnership and collaboration through and through person. Like, people think it's my middle name, right? So I think that if I changed my name to Vanessa Partnerships Adams, it wouldn't be shocking to anybody who knows me. So it's not like I'm disagreeing with myself, but I'm just wanting to underscore the frustration levels that I see when I spend time in rural communities and I have the opportunity to do that. So I think this brings me back to the coffee environment and situation, right? So about 10 years ago, we started working in Ethiopia towards traceable coffee. Traceable meaning that and Starbucks did one tiny pilot on this where you could actually scan your coffee bag or a QR code on your cup and see which farms it was coming from, right? Now that terrifies people like at Kraft and, I was at a wonderful conversation with the lawyers of Kraft and Walmart talking about the reasons why food can't be traceable to farms and all the legal regulatory risks and barriers they were putting on themselves by making that transparency happen. But, from a farmer perspective, you want to know where your food is going or your coffee is going and what kind of value it brings. That makes you make better food and coffee. That makes the buyer, actually willing to pay a little more, because willingness to pay is a huge issue in these supply chains, right? So there again, back to margins and costs. So the EU has had this brilliant idea that if we could make food, in soy and beef and coffee and cocoa traceable, and put responsibility and the burden of legal burden on the importer into the EU to know that the coffee, cocoa, soy, or beef that you're buying did not cause any further deforestation, right? So brilliant idea, but the implementation implications in a country like Ethiopia with 4 to 5 million smallholder farmers who have, between 1 to 3 acres, if they're really lucky, of coffee, but some of them have like a quarter of an acre of coffee. And there are about 15 supply chain processes and linkages of rebagging and cleaning and drying and, recleaning and then rebagging and then re-changing containers and roasting and then rebagging before it even gets to a branded product that you could possibly buy. So the inherent systems are there, okay? Digitally, this is possible. And that's what's so amazing. And we proved it. We actually got a bag of coffee in the UK, I can't say who bought it, but we, barcoded it from the collection point all the way through all those transit processes, and got the list of the 30 farms that that container and bag of coffee actually came from. So the process was proven and works. And when it works, it's amazing and incredible. And you can overlay the baseline information of existing tree populations. And when you know whose farm it is and what they're growing, give a little more AI and metadata into that. This is actually possible. So it's not a technology problem anymore. Now it's about willingness to implement those reforms equitably in a way where those millions and millions of farmers don't actually get backlash, where it's too complicated to track millions of sources of farms, and people now prefer going to 100,000 acre coffee farm in Brazil because it's just one data source, rather than 100,000 data sources. So this is the complexity factors into sustainability in a way where I think we have to weigh it and measure lack of scale or progress and challenges associated to the need for consultation and the complexity of multinational trade routes and corridors, and how pricing factors into that as well. So one thing that came out of that whole pilot that we did on traceability, which wasn't a pilot, by the way, I only say pilot because the regulations changed and the government changed and the management changed. So it did die the first time around. And so that therefore became a pilot, even though it was a national system that we built. But today they're building that national system again in Ethiopia, except they've been there before. So it's much less uncomfortable than it was. It's much less overwhelming. Now it's just like, okay, we know this is possible. There's multiple systems to do it. Who's going to pay for it? And, is the cost and the burden on that farmer producer or on the importer? Of course, the importer is not going to pay more. Or the consumer. Is the consumer going to pay a sustainability price premium? I don't think so, but we can try. Is it a tax? So, how do those trade-offs actually get translated into the right idea, but overly complicating a system which is already super complex for most people's standards. Again, I live in that environment, so to me, that's my bread and butter, and I love it. I could spend all day talking about this, or all week, or all year. Anyway,
no,
so
that makes a lot of.
I wanted to speak to your point about trust, though. So therefore, who has to trust who, or is it a verifiable process where we don't have to rely on the emotion of trust? There's a system by which trust occurs, and because in an environment where inherently people can't trust each other for historic reasons, financial reasons, or where constant abuse is occurring, and trust shouldn't be the case, but systems can create mechanisms for trust. And I think regulations are also ways of doing that, but most of the time don't work in the way we want them to, in Africa, at least. I can't speak for the rest of the world. So I just wanted to overlay more complexity and bring more of the multi-continental agenda into this.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Actually, you just set up exactly what I asked Kate to also talk about, which in some ways is this tension between getting everyone involved in these complex processes towards sustainability and what can go wrong with that. And just this morning I was seeing a new cocoa plantation in Brazil, which is something we didn't usually think about as like something that you would grow at a plantation scale, but what would the implications of that be for smallholder cocoa producers in Africa? And when you have these well-meaning regulations, how do they push private sector in other places? So I think that we're all kind of or this governance discussion is really ripe for how do we make sure that we're actually pushing towards more equitable development, but not sort of going around in circles for so long that we actually end up going another direction. Kate, I wanted to come back to you for I'm sure people have been asking you about abundance, especially being in California. So I would love your take on that and a little bit, how you're thinking about it across your old federal role and your new state advocacy role.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes to what you were just saying about fundamental tensions too. So the very challenging thing about getting to the UN goals from COP28 of a, just managed transition is that an energy transition requires a complete wholesale overhaul of the entire industrial system that we currently have. It's the system that underpins the industrial economy, and we still have it. 85% of the activities in the world economy use fossil fuels in one way or another. So that is a very big deal, thinking about how you move from that to something else. And it requires, a conversation about a continued industrial economy that looks different. So I just want to say that first and foremost. The clean energy economy is still an industrial economy. That is hard. That is a hard conversation to have in a lot of places, because a lot of places have been completely run over by the industrial economy. Like it's, even in the US, which is obviously much less like this in many places, there was so much distrust when we went out through the Biden administration, or I've gone out through the work I've done in other places. Just people are like, well, you sold us this bill of goods about all these benefits we would get. And instead, what we're seeing is, we're seeing a bunch of wind and solar farms that look great and they provide a bunch of power to other places and not a lot of jobs. Like we don't get a lot of tax base from this new thing you're talking about. It's still super industrial. We have to still mine for critical minerals. Like it's not. When you Google, I have a slide on this that I'm not sharing because of no slides, but when you Google clean energy economy, what you see is like an idealized thing of like rolling hills and one wind turbine and a couple of houses, right? An electric car. Everything in that picture has some industry behind it. The wind turbine is 80% steel. You've got people are moving around the vehicle manufacturing market. So I think just starting with this fundamental tension about industry is hard. So what the abundance folks are doing, which is, I think
and just
really,
to be sorry, I just wanted to break in.
Yeah.
Bill reminded me that this abundance argument is very narrow to the US right now. So
it's very narrow. It's essentially an argument that that actually feels very familiar to me from kind of the Obama era on clean energy. It's a little bit of a neoliberal, like move fast and build things argument, where it's like, what we need to do to address climate change or our other big social issues, housing, inequality, all these things, is we need to set the conditions to build things really fast and get rid of a bunch of the barriers in the way of building things really fast. Ezra Klein in the US has become kind of a like poster child of talking about this. There's abundance networks being set up all over the place. Silicon Valley is very pro-abundance because it's not that dissimilar, to be honest, from the argument of like early solar panel development, where people were like, all that matters is making these as cheap as possible so we can get as many of them as possible installed. That led to, of course, as everyone knows, a lot of investment in the Chinese solar panel supply chain, very cheap panels, potentially forced labor, a lot of issues with that. It did not lead to necessarily family supporting careers and the creation of sort of a resilient supply chain in individual local places that might have needed it. So I think there's a lot of interest in it because people are frustrated with the slowness. I mean, everyone's frustrated with the slowness of all of the money that went out the door during the Biden administration. Huge amounts of money, slow progress in getting out the door, a lot of systems that were very clunky and bureaucratic. People are frustrated with increasingly in the US, and I think in other places, housing need is not being met, right? People are paying way more for housing. People are paying way more for services. Infrastructure needs not being met. So there's a very compelling argument now that the abundance folks are making of, we just need to like streamline regulation, move faster, get stuff built. It's, Ezra Klein originally called it supply side progressivism. I think that's what it is, right? There's compelling things about it. On the other hand, what it doesn't do is what we've all been talking about, which is center this conversation about what different building looks like in different places, how it actually impacts those places, how it actually builds on or leverages existing assets, or how it uses resources, how it creates benefits. So I think there's a really interesting moment we're in right now, which I'm doing a lot of work on at California Forward. We just did a think piece on sort of what does a climate smart economy look like with some other folks. There's something in between these two poles. Like, I think it is an issue that the environmental climate movement has primarily been regulatory in its approach to getting climate action. It's primarily been about using the kind of environmental regulatory agenda to say, let's stop all the bad impacts, right? Let's regulate carbon like a local pollutant. Let's do emissions as the key metric. Like, I think that's gotten us to a point, but it's not going to solve for this problem of having to rebuild our entire economy. Then on the other side, there's this pole of like, move fast and build things and get rid of all the regulatory stuff and do permit reform and do all these things where we just build it. And I've been sort of calling that Robert Moses 2.0. I think it's like, it makes me a little nervous. It makes a lot of people a little nervous. What is there in the middle of those things where we're like, okay, yes, emissions shouldn't be the only metric. There are other benefits we should be pushing toward here. We do need to have this negotiation about what are the benefits, who's getting the benefits, and how are we organizing around that in particular places, but not all the way toward like the move fast, just install stuff as cheaply as possible. So I think it's an interesting moment. There's a whole bunch of US critique, and I'm starting to see it in Europe too, about like, what is that? What does that look like? And last thing I'll say on it is I think there's some interesting, in some ways, returning to like older models of development, older before industrial revolution is interesting. So we're starting to see like guild models and like people creating zones where there's community ownership within the zone, and they're setting certain standards and the developers have to meet those standards. We're starting to see sort of some interesting stuff that is kind of public benefits corporations, asking companies to become public benefits corporations who then are actually legally responsible to a mission that goes beyond shareholder profit. I think that's fascinating, like thinking about like not trying to put the square peg into the round hole of our existing systems, which were designed for a stable climate, into this new situation where the climate is not stable. How do we start to think about maybe some other models? Is it, I think, super interesting. So I don't know. So I'm kind of fascinated by this. Like, what are people doing differently? How are we, doing like the Canadians? The last thing I'll say on the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, I'm really interested in this organization. They negotiate on behalf of First Nations with energy developers, and they get, equity ownership in projects for the First Nations. They're not doing like, we need a park as our community benefit, right? We want X number of local jobs. They're like, no, we want to own this. I think that kind of thing is really interesting, and we should all be starting to think outside the box a little on not only the models of governance, but also the models of just like literally like corporate structure and land use and other pieces. So that was a big answer, but
that's a big answer. That's a good note to stop on, that big of an answer. So, Robin, I want to take a line that Vanessa used in her introduction, which was the machinations and trickery that are involved in getting people to work together. And you've been doing this so much, and you also talked about mechanisms for bringing people together that you have explored. So I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that before we start to wrap things up.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, and I love that. I love that quote, machinations and trickery, which of course is one of the challenges that is faced with a lot of public sector projects and private sector projects as well, which is that there is not a perception of trust, right? Oh, you're just a big corporate. You're going to come in here and develop this. You're tricking us. As a base assumption, and you see that all over in different iterations. And so one of the things we really do to try to create that baseline for trust is in the dialogue with the public and the private sector and the community. We're trying to bring in data and studies that are very place specific, because that's important. And I really like that, Kate, about what you were saying. You know, everything happens in a place. And that goes back to the community-based as well, because everything is community-based. And I think we're seeing an increasing acknowledgement of that in our public policy setting, though there certainly needs to be more. But the way that we, so the way that we do that is we make sure that we're bringing in the right experts who, you know the sector, who know the country, who know the community, and can provide, really an academic level of rigor around whatever study needs to be done for that startup, whether it is to change the price of electricity so that EVs can charge at night when wind is blowing, and otherwise they'd have to just let those electrons go off the grid without selling them, right? So it makes a lot of sense to have a lowered price of electricity at night that's specifically for electric vehicle charging, right? But you have to convince a lot of incumbents to change the way they're doing things. And those incumbents aren't necessarily that resistant. They don't really have a reason to pay attention, and nobody's brought them a really good case that they can put in front of their bosses. But if you're able to produce this science-based, fact-based study and say, and we want you to participate in this, bring your expertise to it, and here you have to customize, of course, how you're enabling different experts to provide feedback, because some experts have extremely limited time. Other experts are essentially, for hire as consultants, just depending on where they are in which institutions. So those are some of the machinations, some of the tools that we use for stakeholder gathering. We also the model for the team is one where all of our staff is in our countries of implementation. So we have 6 emerging market and developing economy countries where we implement. So we've got people on the ground in every single one, and they understand what's going on there and who to talk to about what, and who responds to what kind of engagement model, right? And so then we're able to be very dynamic in how we're structuring our workshops or how we're structuring our dialogues, how they're timed over the course of the year, just based on what else is going on in that country and community. I will say one of the other thing about community-based that I find so interesting is that startup ecosystems are themselves very community-based, right? You think of startup ecosystems, and they're each around some smaller geographic region than is typically, the political economy, some smaller region. So and that's also something that we look for in our startups, is that they're coming from those communities, so they also know how to navigate. And that's part of the, I think, reason for their success, of the ones that have been successful, is because they're able to innovate within that community's culture, and understand how to bring in a certain technology that meets a certain need. And with this fintech and mobile device, I can make it affordable. And so, but we want them to be from those places so that they can really understand how to do that, how to structure that, how to dialogue that, and then help them with the investment readiness and the higher political connections. Yeah, so that's. I will also maybe mention that one of the systems that I have found most effective, just in general, for dialogue, is the charrette system. And the charrette system is basically almost like a project management and workshopping approach that's very It's not quite like an ISO standard, but it kind of is that for a certain, a certain kind of workshop style. First you do this, then you do that. And I know that in countries like Australia, that's actually a requirement. In order to build any infrastructure, you have to have design charrettes. It's a legal requirement. So all the engineering companies there, as they begin their infrastructure, just in the design, they actually have to engage in this charrette process, which is a good thing.
Say a
for
little bit
engineering.
more for everyone about how that works.
Yeah, it's just a process for identifying the key stakeholders for the project based on what the project is, and then sort of a structured way of bringing them together and having a dialogue over a series of days or a series of time, just depending on the duration of the project.
So it's a systematic approach to making sure that all voices are heard and
Very much so.
and understanding the scope of the problem. All right. Well, thank you. I'll go around one last time before we wrap up and what we've been finishing these sessions with, and what's been really interesting is one, what you guys have learned from each other, and another, which is sort of what are some big worrying challenges. So I'd love it if we can start with the worrying challenges. What's on your mind that is hardest about making this stuff work, and then something more hopeful about what we've learned in this discussion together. And so I will give it a beat so everyone can think for a second, but Vanessa, I know that you'll be ready to say something.
Anyway, this is a great conversation, and I hope we, Alicia, have an opportunity to reconvene of your 6 webinars, maybe do like a mega bring it all together, final grand finale. But
all of you are very busy people, so I think getting you in the same place at the same time would be impossible, but that's my job.
Yeah, there's a few places we're all likely to probably be in the coming months. You mentioned the COP28, and I was really impressed at COP28 to see how all of these constituents that we're describing had a voice, a place, discussions, dialogues. I felt that that ecosystem came to life in a physical location, and the 70,000 people having the same conversation, even though it was not very climate friendly to show up in Dubai, it worked in terms of I think setting a trajectory, which is leading us into the COP30 conversations in Brazil, building alignment. And we talked a little bit about metrics and measurements, and there's been a huge amount of work around measuring sustainable development goals and impacts. And as I said in the beginning, the UN Food Systems Summit process wanted to actually and planned for taking every 2 years a stock taking to see, is the transition happening? Are people delivering on the commitments that they made? Now it's self-reporting. It's nearly impossible to align between the US commitments of a government that's not there anymore and Kenya's commitments of, a government that has gone through an IMF restructuring. So I think it's very, very, very hard to measure impact and commitment. But I think we have to force ourselves and all of our partners and stakeholders, because, for those of us, I think we're starting to become a bit gray-haired and been around for a while. And we've seen ecosystems where progress is occurring. But when I go back to rural Mali and Bamako and speak to people who are struggling at the forefront of the climate impact and, lack of sufficient rainfall, increasing population, decreasing tree population, unstable government, or recurring changes in governments, things are not progressing at the rate that they need them to. And I think we have to be, strong enough to listen to that angst at the base and be willing to live with that and say, what can we do differently, better, and more, and faster?
Thank you, Vanessa. Turning to Kate, and we do have only a few minutes left, so
Yeah.
challenges, but also learning.
I mean, challenges are sort of obvious in the United
Yeah.
States. It's all very challenging all of a sudden.
Yes.
And I think
Let's move to
scary.
California.
So I won't talk more about that. And it matters for California because, you know, I mean, partly to what Vanessa just said, but you know, as all the things we're talking about are happening, we are seeing increased climate impacts and disasters, and they are taking significant funding, and they are taking significant, you know, they have significant tolls on people and places. And so you know, that is happening simultaneously with trying to build all these new systems. And I think that is challenging, honestly, in general. Hope. I mean, look, I kind of think this conversation's underscored this, and I said a little bit before, but I just think new models of doing things are really interesting. Like, I loved, Robin, your Australia example. Seen a lot of interesting stuff in Canada, seen a lot of interesting stuff in some parts of Europe. How do we, and in some of the states and communities, like we're thinking about resilience districts here in California, we're thinking about green empowerment zones. Like, how do we actually just think about creative new models? And in some ways, I think the challenges in the US are forcing that conversation to be a little faster than it would have been otherwise. Because everyone has been totally shocked out of complacency. So that's interesting. And, you know, we're doing what we can at the local level and trying to build community where we can. So that gives me hope. And it gives me hope that it's happening around the world as well.
Thank you, Kate. And Robin.
Thanks so much. I'm gonna end on a high note because we're all aware of the challenges. I just came from Vietnam. I was in Vietnam last week. Every other year, we hold a big summit, P4G does, of all of our member countries. We have 9 member countries, including 3 high-income countries and 6 emerging market and developing economy countries. So every other year at the heads of state level, these countries gather and invite other countries along as well. This summit was hosted by the government of Vietnam. And over 15 countries attended at either the head of state or minister level and worked together to issue a declaration that essentially calls for multilateral approaches to green trade and investment for a green growth economy. We had over 70 startups, climate tech and nature-based tech startups from around the developing world that were there in a big expo, and they were pitching. We had a couple of deals that were signed, which was great. And it was really a big counterpoint to me, especially coming from Washington, D.C., to be in the middle of that and experience such a very high level of agreement on multilateral green growth approaches. So I leave that as a very encouraging note, because I think we're seeing a lot of the rest of the world just pragmatically move on in their approach to trade and development. And that's fundamentally what we need, because the more pragmatic trade and development that is built in a consultative manner, the more of that we have, the better I think we'll all be.
Yeah. Well, thank you to all 3 of you for taking the time to join us today. These discussions have been really valuable to our own research moving forward, but also to I hope to people who have been able to join with us throughout these 6 seminars. So this was our final seminar in this seminar series. Working papers, videos of the 6 seminars, and in the future, updating working papers will be available on the website. This is part of an ongoing project on capacity building for sustainable development. And as we continue to work in this, both from speakers in the seminar series, but also participants, we'd love to hear with you with thoughts on what we didn't cover, more ideas on what we did cover but got wrong, other cases we should be exploring. So please do really reach out. Thank you once again to Victoria and Claire for being in the background, making sure all of this got done logistically, and to my silent co-conspirator, Bill Clark, for doing a lot of the heavy lifting behind the scenes as well. And thank you to the Mosafir Hamani Center for Business and Government and the Sustainability Science Program, and the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainable Development for supporting our work. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Alicia. Bye, everyone.